Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for being with us today. In the age of Instagram Reels, TikTok Lives, and viral wellness trends, information about health and nutrition is more accessible than ever before, but it's also more distorted. From fad diets promising rapid weight loss to conspiracy theories about seed oils and sugar substitutes, today's conversations about health are often shaped by algorithms rather than trusted science. Fueled by unrealistic beauty standards, diet culture, and a multi-billion-dollar supplement industry offering paid product placement, social media users with massive platforms can and often do spread misinformation fast, leading to dangerous health outcomes. At the same time, public trust in established science and health agencies is faltering. Today, we'll learn how to determine when nutrition advice might be more harmful than helpful and set the record straight on some common misconceptions about what we put into our bodies. Joining us by phone today, we have Michelle Boltz, who is the Assistant Professor and Director of Dietetics at the University of Akron. Michelle, thank you for being with us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Also on the phone, we have Caroline Hopkins-Legaspi, a health reporter at the New York Times. Caroline, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Now, we would love for you to be a part of this conversation. I'm talking to our audience now. You can give us a call with a comment or a question. The number to do that is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. You can also send us a message on Instagram. We are at IdeaStreamNEO, and you can send me a message directly at _Stephanie Haney. Now, Michelle, I will direct the first question to you. To start, can you please explain the difference between a nutritionist and a dietitian?
Sure, thanks for that opportunity. So a registered dietitian has to go through quite a bit to get to that point. We have a graduate degree. We go through an accredited nutrition curriculum. We complete over 1,000 hours in clinical rotation, like an internship. We call it supervised experiential learning, where we go into hospitals, we have direct patient care, we go into the community, again, providing nutrition assessment. We do food systems management type rotations and long-term care as well. Once we complete our graduate degree, all the accredited work, we go through these clinical rotations, then we sit for a registration exam, a national exam. After that, pass that exam, you have to have 75 continuing education hours every 5 years. We in Ohio fall under the Ohio Medical Board. That's where our licensure lies. And so we take that oath to first do no harm and really protect the public.
Now, when it comes to someone labeling themselves as a nutritionist,
Right.
What's required there?
Not much, believe it or not. With the word nutritionist, anything goes. Now, I will say, back when I went to school, it was registered and licensed dietitian. Several years ago, registered and licensed dietitians can refer to themselves as registered dietitian nutritionists. So you would see that as an RDN, or you might just see RD, registered dietitian. But the word dietitian is in there regardless. If somebody is calling themselves a nutritionist and doesn't have the word dietitian in there, then they might have got that license over a weekend course. So they don't have that rigor of academia. They don't have that internship, those clinical hours. They don't fall under any governing board that would require them to follow evidence-based research and first do no harm. So going to somebody who doesn't have the registered dietitian nutritionist or registered and licensed dietitian under their name, really, you need to beware.
That's good information to have. You know, I could go over the weekend, apparently, it sounds like, and become a nutritionist if I wanted to. And I don't necessarily think that would qualify me to be giving health advice. I will tell you that right now. Okay, so Michelle, you have a lot of experience here. Tell us about your expertise and what you teach.
Yeah, thanks. So I have 30 years experience as a registered and licensed dietitian, always in this area. I actually did my internship at the Cleveland Clinic main campus, and I've worked here at the University of Akron for over 24 years. I teach a whole lot of nutrition courses. I'm the director, as you said, of our dietetics graduate program, Masters of Public Health, here at the University of Akron, and we're part of a consortium with NeoMed, Youngstown State, and Cleveland State. So it's really neat that we can have our students come through here and then become registered and licensed dietitians with a Master in Public Health as well. I teach graduate level and some undergraduate level clinical nutrition courses. I've always had a clinical background as a dietitian. I also hold certifications. I'm a certified sports specialist dietitian, and I'm certified in obesity and weight management.
All right, now, Caroline, I'll turn to you. You've been a health reporter with the New York Times for some time now. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience there?
Sure. And I should just start by saying that the difference between registered dietitian and nutritionist is something that guides my work every day. Like, I don't think before I became a nutrition reporter that I was really aware of that tremendous amount of difference in the requirements that goes into, the training and everything. And if you're just a regular person on TikTok or Instagram, the nutrition expert, quote unquote, being a dietitian or being a nutritionist might seem the same to you. So it is really important. And for my work, I often check to make sure someone has that RD before consulting them for an article. But yeah, you're right. For the well section of the New York Times, and a big part of what we do is sort of try to unpack health claims. Is something really a superfood, or is it, your secret ticket to healthier skin, digestion, weight loss, etc., and sort of diving into what the research really says about that food or supplement. And in many cases, actually, it turns out if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
And in your experience covering nutrition, Caroline, when did we start to see health misinformation become such a widespread issue?
I think it's always been a widespread issue, right? Going back to even before the age of the internet, people were trying to hawk their supplements and claim that whatever food they're selling or profiting off of is going to be your ticket to a healthful life. But I think it's really exploded with TikTok and Instagram and just the accessibility of this misinformation. Anyone can just open their phones and come across, thousands of an endless scroll of videos, and it's hard to parse, what's backed in science and what's not.
Speaking of that, trying to figure out what's backed in science and what's not, we want to invite our callers, if they have any questions for our experts that we have with us today. That number to call is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. We invite you to email and call in with any claims that you've seen online that you'd like for us to talk to our experts about and talk about the spread of that information online. Caroline, are there certain groups that are more vulnerable to believing or spreading false information?
Honestly, anyone is vulnerable to it. I think that especially with the just incredible technology behind these algorithms that target people that have perhaps once you clicked on something, a supplement, and now you're getting even more misinformation about, other supplements and other foods. So it sort of snowballs, I suppose. I wouldn't say that any particular group might be more vulnerable, but, everybody can sort of fall into that trap.
That's a good lesson to remember. I know when I click on something, if I watch a video, say I'm watching a video, just something as simple as dogs. If I'm watching dog videos, the next thing I know, there are 20 dog videos in my feed. That algorithm tends to pick up on what you've clicked on, and whether or not it vibes with you or not, you do tend to get more of that information. Michelle, I'll turn back to you now. What are some red flags that people should look out for that might indicate a diet is a harmful fad rather than a sustainable, evidence-based approach to nutrition?
Awesome. So red flags would be anything that offers a quick fix. If it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is. Also, when whole food groups are eliminated, that is always a red flag. If they say you can do this with no exercise, that would be a red flag. And certainly if it lacks scientific evidence, these are all really red flags. That quick weight loss is a red flag. There's so much more that goes into that. And adding on to what you just mentioned about, I agree, everybody's vulnerable to the misinformation that's out there. And I think that people who have struggled with weight their whole life and have gone through yo-yo type diets, they are very much at risk for falling prey to these types of misinformation that are out there in social media.
Caroline, you had mentioned that when you're looking up sources or trying to connect with someone for a story, and you might be looking at social media, for example, you're looking for that registered dietitian hallmark. I want to ask you, social media influencers, whether they have that credibility or not, or that credential rather or not, they now play a large role in shaping public perceptions about health and nutrition. Can you tell us the pros and cons of that?
Absolutely. And I guess in addition to registered dietitian, I might look to see if someone, perhaps has a PhD in nutrition. That's also somebody who I might feel comfortable. It depends on the topic, right? If it's something that I want to speak with someone about their research, perhaps a PhD in that area of nutrition would be a credible expert as well. So in addition to registered dietitian, but yeah, many of these social media influencers do not have those credentials. And in many cases, it's not necessarily nefarious, they're not trying to dupe you, but they might not really know that what they're promoting is misinformation either. So, you asked for pros and cons. I would say the positive is the accessibility of information. People don't have to, drive to a clinic and sit down with someone. I mean, there's definitely reasons why that is probably preferred for actual dietary advice that is personalized to you. But just at the tip of your fingers, you can access information. So that's a pro. But obviously, on the flip side of that, it's hard to parse what is and isn't legitimate. And with influencers who often sort of, speak to your vulnerabilities, they seem like, they're connecting with you on a personal level when, that really isn't the case. And going back to your previous question about people who might be particularly vulnerable to this type of misinformation, something I left out in my answer was people who might be going through a chronic disease or have a family member who's been diagnosed with something. And, if you've spent time Googling or, engaging with content online about that condition, then you're probably going to be served more misinformation. This can cure your cancer, or this can, treat your IBS or whatnot. And if you're in that position where you're vulnerable or you're scared about a loved one, you might be more inclined to try it out or want to believe it when there really isn't much legitimacy behind it.
We have an email in from an audience member, Tom, and he writes, I would like to see a browser extension which would use AI and user voting to determine likelihood of truth. To the guests, are there any tools out there that can help listeners fact-check claims online? Caroline, I'll ask you to respond to that.
Unfortunately, I do not have a golden ticket tool that would be very helpful as well for me in my work. But I think that, to really parse whether something's legitimate, you sort of have to do the legwork, turn to the primary sources, there's a lot of good information on, historically there's been a lot of good information on our public health websites, CDC and local public health information for state and local health departments have pretty trustworthy sources. So, anything that's a .gov or a source that's, vetted there. And then the scientific literature, that's a good place to turn to. And again, when in doubt, turning to experts who have those credentials. Those are sort of the hallmarks of what I do. I don't think there's a magical tool. Michelle, maybe you know of one. But yeah, I think it's hard to sort of, all the different misinformation is so nuanced that it would, I imagine, be difficult to
I will
create
ask.
that tool.
Yeah, sure. Michelle, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks. And I totally agree with everything Caroline said. And I would just add that perhaps definitely the .gov, definitely the .orgs, eatright.org is a nice fact check area. That is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And you can find some information there, fact versus fiction, and then get to those primary resources as well, that scientific literature, if you want to look at the actual sites. So yeah, I would add that.
I just want to mention the AI piece because Tom brought up hoping for an AI tool. AI is
Yeah.
tricky. AI is very tricky. It learns from what's on the internet, and we've seen instances where AI hallucinates. So I just want to put that out there for the conversation. They call it hallucinations.
Yeah.
It's invented information. It's very interesting. That's a topic for another day. We're going to get into some of these specific claims now. Michelle, I want to ask you, our current U.S. Health and Human Service Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., claimed on social media on X that seed oils are a leading cause of the obesity epidemic. So can you tell us what are seed oils and what does the current science say about them?
So the obesity epidemic is very complex and more complex than pinpointing it on one item. So I think we need to first understand that. And really looking at the different review articles and the different studies and all that we can synthesize from that, the current scientific literature really does support incorporating seed oils into a well-rounded diet as an alternative to saturated fat. So these seed oils being things like palm oil, olive oil, flaxseed oil, for example, peanut oil, canola oil, in moderation, as with anything, we can include this type of oil. And the majority of peer-reviewed studies really don't support a potential inflammatory or oxidative effect when it's consumed in typical dietary amounts, and really limiting highly processed foods, incorporating it in moderation with fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and as a well-rounded diet, looking at balance, variety, and moderation.
So when we're talking about seed oils, are we talking about things like grapeseed oil? What exactly are we talking about?
We're talking about things like, these oils are plant sources, so things like flaxseed oil, canola oil, peanut oil, olive oil, even rice or bran oil. So again, in moderation, they can be included in a healthy diet, especially when they're replacing saturated fats. What we know about saturated fat, because these seed oils are polyunsaturated, so they're an unsaturated fat versus a saturated fat. Saturated fat is in, when you think about highly processed meats, bologna, salami, bacon, things like this. Saturated fats have a link with increasing LDL, which is your bad cholesterol, if you will. And so when we have these types of plant oils in moderation in a typical diet to replace saturated fats, they don't seem to be causing as much harm, and they certainly aren't the cause of obesity. Again, obesity is very complicated.
Michelle, another question for you. A recent study out of Norway published in the JAMA Medical Journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, found that a healthy prenatal diet might lower the risk for an autism diagnosis. Now, President Trump recently claimed that there might be a link between acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol, and autism. Now, given this news, what advice would you give expectant parents when it comes to nutrition, supplement use, and over-the-counter medications during pregnancy?
Okay, so in terms of over-the-counter medications, that's between the OBGYN and the patient, because there are medications that, depending if the patient still needs to be on that medication, that's between the doctor and them, and medications are ranked in a way that determining whether or not the woman can stay on that medication while she's pregnant. I am a food-first dietitian, so in terms of supplements, when somebody is pregnant, that's again an individual basis on what that supplement would need to be based on that person's dietary habits and needs. And in terms of a well-rounded diet, that's what we're looking for when a woman is pregnant. Funny you say this, because today in class I'm teaching about pregnancy and lactation.
Oh.
In about half an hour. So, but anyway, we're looking at getting enough energy into that body, enough calories into that body, enough carb, enough protein, enough healthy fats to support a healthy pregnancy. Of course, we have to look at those micronutrients as well. We can try to meet those with food, but a prenatal vitamin, certainly under the advice of the OBGYN, may be part of the plan.
Well, thank you for giving us an opportunity to audit your class 30 minutes in advance. Thank you for that, Michelle. Caroline, I'm going to go back to you now. We've talked about a couple different studies here today already. So with so much new data emerging constantly, often with conflicting results, how do you stay on top of it all and decide what's credible and what is not?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I think a big part of it is, looking at, so I guess looking at how the studies were designed. If it's new study, claims X can increase your risk for whatever condition. Nutrition studies are sort of notoriously hard to conduct, which I've learned through reporting on them. I think a lot of people will inaccurately pull from a study and say this food, this ingredient causes X, when in reality, the study wasn't designed to determine if it caused that condition so much as if it's linked or associated with it. So that difference between correlation and causation is something that's lost a lot in articles and social media posts about nutrition. So, if you take a big group of people and ask them what they ate for a number of years, and you look at rates of a certain condition, well, you could sort of deduce that, the people that ate a higher amount of whatever food it is you're looking at were more likely to have that condition. But that does not mean the same thing as saying that food caused it. So when I'm sort of trying to decide what to cover, I really look at if something is a study that's, looking at correlation or association, or if it's looking at cause. And those studies are kind of few and far between. It doesn't mean I wouldn't cover a study that was about correlation, but definitely would couch it with a lot of caveats, such as, something else about these people's lives or their habits could have contributed to that condition. So, if they, they're drinking a lot of coffee, but they're also exercising every day, and they're also, seeing a healthcare provider more often or whatnot, that could contribute to whatever positive health outcome the study concludes, whereas someone might pull from that, like coffee caused someone to live longer or be healthier. So long-winded way of saying I look at how the study was designed, and that's a big part of how I decide what to cover.
Definitely a lot to take into consideration there. I want to remind our audience, if you want to call in with any questions for our experts today, that number is 866-578-0903. You can also email in at soi@ideastream.org. Maybe you've seen a claim on social media that you're curious about. Michelle, I'm going to go back to you now. There's been a lot of talk about gut health online lately, and we're talking about a lot of these things online. I just want to remind everyone that what happens online makes its way IRL, in real life, into the mainstream. So it starts online, but it becomes a broader conversation. So, Michelle, some recent trends include taking a spoonful of olive oil daily or drinking chia seed water. Are these practices beneficial?
They're not needed, no. In terms of either one of those, they're not going to harm you. Olive oil is a monounsaturated fat, and that can help to increase our good cholesterol levels. Chia seeds, they're nice, anti-inflammatory, they have fiber. And so these things aren't necessarily a miracle, right? They're not a miracle elixir. It again comes down to you don't want to be drinking, a half a cup of olive oil a day. And that's sometimes what happens is we hear that something's good, so more is better. And I think that's also something that we need to be very cautious about when these types of miracle little elixirs come out, because while, again, the olive oil and chia is a great thing to include in a healthy diet, it doesn't mean more is better. And so, looking at a whole well-rounded diet, getting fruits in, which have fiber, getting vegetables in, which have fiber, getting whole grains in, which has fiber. And guess what? All that's carb. But what we hear is don't eat carb, right? Have lots of olive oil, have lots of chia seeds, don't eat carb. But we want to eat carb. Carb is to a human like gasoline is to a car. And that's one of the big fad diets that I run into constantly. We also have a nutrition center here on campus, of which I am the director, and we do a lot of counseling for the local community and the campus community. And everybody's afraid of carb, when in reality, complex carbs like whole grains and fruits and vegetables have some great fiber in there and phytochemicals that can help promote gut health.
Let's talk about sugars now, Michelle. Many people believe that unrefined sugars like honey or maple syrup, for example, are healthier than white sugar. Is that true?
They're all sugar. It's all sugar. Sugar is sugar, yeah. And again, in excess, sugar can be inflammatory. So, we have recommendations on not having more than 10% of our calories coming from added sugar. This is awesome that when you look at the food label now, A relatively recent change was added sugar was put on the food label. You want to look to the far right column. You want to see that added sugar closer to 5% because that would be a low source of added sugar. If you see it at 10%, it's a good source. If you see it at 20%, it's a high source. So whatever that sugar is, maple syrup or white sugar, we want to look at the foods we're eating and look that added sugar, no matter where it's coming from, is closer to a 5% than a 20%. It's just an easy way to look.
So you mentioned food labels there. I want to dig into that just a little bit more, Michelle. When we see terms like gluten-free or sugar-free on a food label, do we take that at face value? Is that a positive thing? What should we take from that?
So what the food label actually does have regulation by the FDA. And so when you see something claimed on a food label, you can trust that. What you cannot trust is when you see a supplement facts panel. So a food label has a nutrition facts panel. The supplement label has a supplement facts panel. And that's where we run into some issues because what's claimed on a supplement doesn't have to be true because there isn't regulation over the supplement world.
Okay, that brings me to a question for you about supplements. I know previously you had mentioned that you're a nutrition-first dietitian.
Mm-hmm.
Is it necessary to take supplements? I know that's a very broad stroke question to ask, but can we get all the nutrition we need from our diet?
Yeah, theoretically you can. Now there are some people, and I will say again, I'm a clinical dietitian. We do a lot of counseling here out of our nutrition center. There are people who have diagnoses where that either limit different things they can eat due to intolerances, allergies, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, whatever it is. And then there are eating patterns that might limit different foods, like a vegan, somebody who eats no animal, which is fine. And so there are cases where a nutrition assessment is done by a dietitian, and we can determine, what are we meeting through the diet and what can we not meet through the diet for whatever reason. Then do we need to supplement and in what amount? And so, we want to look at when are supplements needed and to what degree. Looking at labs also is helpful to know when somebody might need a supplement. But even looking, so if you don't have any conditions that would limit what you eat, if you eat a well-rounded diet, then yeah, you can meet your nutrient needs through food. Even an elite athlete can meet their nutrient needs through food, especially if they're meeting their energy intake, which means their calorie intake, because when we eat food, we get calories and we get nutrients.
Caroline, I want to return to you now and ask, how concerned are you about the broader impact of health misinformation, particularly in terms of public trust in science and the medical community?
Yeah, I mean, they're directly related. When somebody believes something and then they find out it's misinformation, every time that happens, it sort of erodes the trust that someone has in nutrition information. And so, yeah, it sort of, again, snowballs. If you have people who are mistrusting the credible, sources, the people who have studied this in school and done countless clinical hours on it, that's a problem. It's tough to sort of see what the solution is other than sort of countering the misinformation with positive information. Because, trying to go out there and debunk every nutrition claim that's circulating on TikTok or Instagram is just sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. Anytime you write an article saying this is a scam, another 5 scams come up in its place. So I think that is sort of an effort that needs to be combated with positive, credible, in other words, much more effective to put credible information out there than try to squash every piece of misinformation. But if you don't, the public trust will sort of continue to erode.
Do you see any of that bleed into reaction to your reporting on nutrition?
Absolutely. I get readers all the time who say, what you reported is false. Look at this source, and then they'll link to something that sort of falls into all of these red flags that we've been talking about. Untrained nutritionist who isn't citing science, who is claiming something. And so someone will sort of send that to me as a counterpoint to what I've reported on. And that's really tough because you sort of see there that person has not been able to parse what is rooted in science and what isn't.
We have a call now from Nancy from Cleveland Heights who has a question about a claim that Nancy has seen online. Nancy, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
My question is, my internet is being bombarded with miracle claims of pink Himalayan salt, that somehow it magically makes you lose weight incredibly fast. And then the other thing that I'm being bombarded with is claims about the magic of beetroot and that it is supposed to be so wonderful. And the interesting things about all these claims is you have to watch like a 20-minute video, which to me is always a sign of something's amiss. But I'd like to hear their comments about those two topics, which seem to be on my internet constantly.
Thank you for the question, Nancy. Michelle, can you kind of help us get to the bottom of the pink Himalayan sea salt and the beetroot?
Yeah, I've not heard about the pink Himalayan sea salt being a miracle elixir for weight loss. So that's interesting. And salt is salt. So, and we know that salt in excess can contribute to high blood pressure, and where sodium goes, water flows. And so if anybody has a medical condition where they hold on to fluid, a heart condition, for example, that would not be something I'd want somebody to start having, right? We get enough salt in our daily diet. The average American probably gets in 3,300 milligrams of sodium a day, and we don't want more than 23 or 2,400 milligrams. So definitely don't see any science behind that. The beetroot juice is a little bit of a different story. That has a little bit of a effect in terms of vasodilating and delivering oxygen to tissue. And so that in some, not for weight loss, but looking at that in the more athletic or exercising type world, there is some thought around that, but some people respond to it differently. Some people are heavy responders, light responders, non-responders, and can cause some gastrointestinal upset. Neither one of these are miracle elixirs. So I hope that answers the question to some degree.
Michelle, I'm going to stay with you for a moment. We got an email in from Jordan and also an email in from Courtney referring back to our seed oil conversation earlier. We were talking about seed oils in general and then also mentioned olive, palm, and avocado oil. Can you clarify the difference between those oils in terms of seed versus plant?
Well, they're all
fruit oils,
plant.
rather.
Yeah, they're all plant, and again, just incorporating those is a way to replace saturated fat, and saturated fat is really the thing that we need to be watching in our diet.
Okay, so just clarifying the difference, whether something is originated from an actual seed or from a fruit, it still kind of has the same effect in terms on our nutrition. Is that accurate? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, these are omega-6. And so the plant being in the seeds, such as a flaxseed or canola versus, olive being fruit. So it both all contain omega-6, which is linoleic acid, and that's a polyunsaturated fat.
Thank you for
clarifying.
Which
is better than saturated fat.
Thank you for clarifying that, Michelle. We appreciate it. We have an email in from Claudia from Kent as well. So Claudia writes that a former doctor had recommended that Claudia take a vitamin D supplement, but then that supplement then apparently resulted in an increased level of vitamin D in her system and then was told to discontinue the supplement. So can you discuss vitamin D?
Yeah, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and we theoretically could get 90% of our vitamin D met from the sun, but obviously, where we live, we don't have like this beating down sun all the time. And so could somebody be deficient in vitamin D? Yeah, but it would be erroneous to say everybody in this area is deficient in D. And so when we get our blood level checked, and if our vitamin D level is low, your doctor will probably put you on a prescription, either a daily dose or a weekly dose, and maybe that's what happened to this person. And then I'd say every 3 months, you want to get that level checked to see how did your body respond to that dose. And if you get into a normal range, great, let's cut down the dose, or maybe you can even come off of that dose. If the level went high, like you were a really great responder to that supplement, then yeah, your doctor would need to take you off of that. Vitamin D is, when it gets high chronically, can be dangerous because vitamin D stores calcium in the body, and we can start placing calcium where it doesn't belong, like in soft tissue. So you don't want to place extra calcium in that liver because that could cause those cells to get hard and die. So you want to check your blood levels before you start any supplement, first of all, and then monitor blood levels once a supplement is started and back down or come off of it when it's time.
All right, we'll be wrapping up here in just a moment. Michelle, one more question for you to button things up on your end. Is there any high-level advice that you would like to let people know when it comes to taking care of our nutrition and what we should kind of be mindful of when we're getting our information?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'd say, really look for your credible sources. Again, the registered dietitian, nutritionist, registered dietitian, going to those sites that we talked about, the eatright.org, even myplate.gov. That's a nice interactive site. It has lots of good information, and you can plug in your own personal information and get a little meal plan. And if it seems too good to be true, it is. If it's offering a quick fix, it does. Health and wellness is a lifetime journey of balance, variety, moderation, physical activity, and knowing what works for you and your health conditions. And that's what a dietitian does. We really do a full nutrition assessment before we give any interventions.
And Caroline, is there anything you would like to say to our audience? You've been reporting on nutrition for quite some time. Any best practices you've learned when you're trying to figure out what's the best information to follow?
Sure, I would echo everything Michelle just said, and then also add, just always keep in mind what the financial interests are behind something you're encountering online or a study you're sort of trying to make sense of. And if you go to the funding source and you see it was funded by, the meat industry, the sugar industry, some sort of group that has a financial interest in perhaps this food looking better for you than it is, that's always a red flag. And we didn't really touch on that, but I think always just keeping in mind when you see a post online, would the person who's trying to give you this information benefit from your buying that food or supplement? And yeah, again, anything that's too good to be true probably is. And anything that's sort of focused on one food in isolation, what I hear over and over again when I talk to dietitians for articles is a healthy diet is all about the big picture. If you're eating a quote unquote superfood every day, but you're also eating a bunch of fast food and high sugar refined food on the, in addition to that superfood, you're not going to get the quote unquote superfood benefits that somebody's claiming about it, because it's all about the big picture, right? So anytime you see something claiming that one food is the ticket to better health, lower risks of disease, etc., I think that's really just something to be aware of and see as a red flag.
Thank you for sharing that experience with us. Caroline Hopkins-Legaspi, health reporter at the New York Times. We appreciate you being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Michelle Boltz, assistant professor and director of dietetics at the University of Akron. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, it's time now for a break. And when we're back, we'll talk about what happens when there aren't enough bus drivers to get kids to school. This is a problem that's happening across the state. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. A week ago, Mentor Public Schools announced at 6:15 in the morning that it had to close all schools that day. This was because of a major bus driver shortage. The superintendent said 9 drivers would need coverage. 3 of them were last-minute call-ins, and even with all of their substitutes and staff, they could not fill the need to get those kids to school. The expansion of the state's EdChoice voucher program and its requirement for public schools to transport voucher students to private and public schools has complicated matters, not just for Mentor, but for public schools across the country. Joining me to talk about school transportation today in our state is Ohio Public Radio and Television State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler. Karen, thank you for calling in.
Hey, great to talk to you.
Now, if you have questions, if you're in our audience and you'd like to respond with a comment or a question on this topic, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. Karen, you've been reporting for 5 years now on Ohio's school bus driver shortage. What are some of the main contributors to this problem, some of which caused what we saw last week in Mentor?
Well, a big part of it is that you've got about 90% of school districts around the state that have ongoing or severe shortages of bus drivers just from last year carrying over into this year. And it's things like low pay compared to what drivers with commercial driver's licenses can make in the private sector. You've got competition from other schools, you've got competition from commercial trucking companies, and you've got people who are retiring. They're burned out sometimes, and they're just ready to leave the business. And so these are just a couple of the factors that are involved here. But when you look at the actual numbers here, before the pandemic, Ohio employed 25,706 active bus drivers. But by August of this year, that number was down to just under 19,000. So 7,000 drivers cut since the pandemic. And so, again, it's attrition, it's retirement, it's bus drivers just leaving, and these positions just aren't being filled.
Let's talk about really quickly what happened in Mentor last week. Craig Heath, the superintendent of Mentor Public Schools, sent out a note after that closure happened, and he said they're currently lacking 2 full-time bus driver positions. Those positions are unfilled, and they're covering those with office staff. So presumably those staff are getting commercial driver's license. That's just 2 of the shortages that they are starting with every single day. Then they had 4 drivers out on extended leave, and then they had 5 drivers absent, and those 3 last-minute call-ins. So you can see how this starts to snowball, and then a school might be in a situation where you just can't cover those routes, and then how do you decide what route doesn't run? So Mentor Public Schools closed that day. Now, I was particularly surprised to learn, Karen, that school districts have their office staff and custodians getting commercial driver's license. But that's not enough to cover all of the needs that they have. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I have a neighbor in my neighborhood who works IT at a school district. I'm here in Columbus, of course, who drives a bus. He's been doing it for a while, in addition to his regular job. When he can, he picks up a bus route. Just spoke to a superintendent over the weekend who has driven a bus when he can to pick up a route. This is a pretty common thing to do because the shortages are so real and so significant. When my son was in high school, we would get regular calls that there would be a 2-hour delay because they had to readjust the bus schedules because there weren't enough bus drivers. So when districts can't absorb that and can't find staff who have CDLs, who have the training that's needed to drive those buses, they have to make other arrangements. Sometimes they have to delay school or, in Mentor's case, close school.
And, that's an important point to drive home here, is not just anyone can get behind the wheel of a school bus. You have to have that commercial driver's license to do it.
And you have to have pretty significant safety training. I mean, school districts do prioritize safety. And, driving a school bus is a unique set of circumstances. And you're responsible for all those kids on the bus. And for a lot of people, it's a responsibility that it's hard for them to accept because this is precious cargo.
Now, in Dayton, the superintendent of Dayton schools there, David Lawrence, he told the Associated Press that it was, quote, madness, that the Ohio legislature had diverted roughly $2.5 billion in state education funding to the voucher program over the next 2 years, and then is still requiring public districts to cover the transportation costs for those students. And Lawrence said that if you didn't have to transport non-public students, that they could easily provide buses. So can you talk more about the state requirement and whether the state has money to public schools, whether the state is giving money to public schools to help with transportation costs?
Well, the state has long had this requirement that public schools would transport private school students from kindergarten through 8th grade who live more than 2 miles from school, or any student with an individualized education plan or an IEP. And so that's, in the most current data that's available, that's more than 66,000 non-public and charter school students who are bused by public school districts. And the impact of this is pretty dramatic because a consultant who was working for the Ohio School Boards Association in the transportation area told me that since Ohio eliminated state funding for school bus purchases in 2009, that's forced districts to absorb about $1.68 billion in capital costs. So they've had to take that. And they also said that there's just not enough money for transportation of students. I mean, school districts get about $1,500 to transport students, but for some districts, that's just simply not enough. And so when you start adding voucher students in, you start adding more schools to bus routes. That makes those bus routes longer. And, it makes it more difficult for school districts to transport not only their students, but also the other students that they are obligated under the law to move to school.
Now, some districts, like Cleveland Public Schools, have argued that they can't afford to transport voucher students, and they have decided to take the tactic of paying families $600 to transport their own kids. Is this unique to Cleveland schools? Is that happening in other schools across the state, Karen?
It's happening in other schools, definitely. The state does, like I said, provide $1,500 per student for voucher transportation. But school districts say the cost is much greater than that. Just in Franklin County and Columbus, we've got more than 3,800 students who've been declared impractical to transport by bus by local school districts. And school districts can do that. They can declare that certain students are ineligible. Now, when Columbus Public Schools did that last year, Attorney General Dave Yost sued them, saying that that was inappropriate. And twice he's been rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court in ordering that district to transport all of those students. But, you know, Columbus Public Schools, for instance, spends more than 6% of its budget on transportation, and that's the highest percentage among these large urban districts. And it's a lot of kids that they're transporting, not only their own kids, but also to add on these private school students, these charter school students, many of whom are on vouchers.
We have an email in from David from Twinsburg on this exact topic, and his comment is, how about we just stop transporting private school kids? And he calls that, quote, what a stupid law. David, thank you very much for your comment. We appreciate it. We want to go to a call now from Steve in Northfield. Steve, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the burden should be placed more on the parents and give them the obligation. But during COVID, most students in Ohio didn't need buses. They stayed home, and they did their work and they're learning from their computers or otherwise. And you know, another thing is that students with disabilities, the government hires chartered vans, private transportation to take those type of students into school. But there are other solutions, and I like that one where City of Cleveland is paying parents to take their own kids to school instead of the government has the burden.
Thank you for sharing that comment, Steve. We appreciate you calling in to the Sound of Ideas. Now, Karen, Republican State Senator Andrew Brenner, who is the chair of the Senate Education Committee, has said he doesn't believe there is a transportation crisis, as public school advocates say there actually is a transportation crisis. So can you tell us about his point of view?
Well, he says because the state is giving $1,500 per student for voucher transportation, and yet schools are giving between $600 and $1,200 when they refuse to transport a student and give that money to parents. He says that he's afraid that some school districts are actually making money on transporting students. And the consultant that I've been talking to with the School Boards Association has said that is not true. It's actually, that's one district that he's talking about here. And the costs to transport students are 5 to 10 times higher due to longer routes and fewer students per bus than that $1,500 that the state is giving. So this whole idea of maybe making a bill that would eliminate the requirement that public school districts transport private school students, that's something that I think is being talked about. I mean, Senator Brenner has talked about that as well, or at least making some changes to that law. And, there's a real struggle here between school districts saying that they are having real trouble hiring bus drivers and paying these transportation costs to get all these students to school. And we see this in the number of school bus drivers. The numbers I presented earlier are indicative of that school districts are really having trouble hiring bus drivers, and they're having to come up with other solutions.
In Mentor, when we talk about solutions, it was announced on Monday that LakeTran, which is the transit agency that serves Lake County, will operate 2 bus routes for Mentor schools. They said that the closure last week actually prompted applications for 2 open bus driver positions. Other districts in the state, what are they doing? Are they relying on public transit to help get their students to school?
Well, and Columbus City Schools is actually talking about exactly that. They're having to look at their budgets and potentially make some cuts here. And so they are considering looking at Central Ohio Transit Authority, COTA buses. These are some of the solutions that are out there that are being discussed. I mean, districts are looking at hiring, finding different ways to hire bus drivers, because that split shift is a problem for some people because you have to do it in the morning and in the evening, raising wages, offering bonuses for hiring on, trying to find better ways to communicate with parents about how what's happening here. This is a problem that's happening around the country too. It's not just Ohio, though it feels like it's really hitting very hard in Ohio. But this is the kind of thing that school people will tell you really needs some creative solutions, and it's been going on for a while, to the point where they're really starting to worry about how to make this work over the long term.
We have an email in now from Eliza, who is suggesting a possible solution here. Her question is, how about vans and small buses instead of school buses? And then maybe commercial driver's license wouldn't be needed then.
I'm not sure what the requirements of that would be. I mean, certainly you'd still have to train those folks to drive, because again, the training is really critical to make sure that kids are protected and that drivers know exactly what's going on, when they're transporting kids. And again, transporting kids is a whole different thing, because you might have to deal with behavioral problems. You've got multiple stops. You've got all sorts of other things going on. But certainly that's probably being discussed. I mean, the groups that are working on this and have been for a while have been trying desperately to come up with something that settles this, because this is a lingering problem. Again, for 5 years here, we've been talking about this.
We have another email in as well from Kevin asking Karen, are drivers getting benefits such as retirement and health care? Karen, do you have the answer to that?
I think full-time drivers, just like any full-time school employee, would get that. But again, the concern is, because the shift is odd, you've got the morning shift and the afternoon shift. If you drive both shifts, is that enough hours? And these are the kind of things that school districts are exploring. They're exploring how to potentially have people drive a bus and then maybe work in the school building and have an 8-hour day that goes like that, or to do some different things with scheduling. But yeah, I mean, school district positions, if they're full-time, do provide those opportunities.
Ohio Public Radio and Television State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler, thank you very much for being with us today.
Hey, great to be on. Thanks.
All right, that'll wrap up the show for today. To get the last word on today's topics, you can email us at soi@ideastream.org. You can find us on Instagram at ideastreamneo.